What's up, YouTube? This is Too Raw for TV. All right, so in this video, I got a request, all right, from a subscriber of mine, Victor Lyons TV, and he wanted me to talk about Gary Payton. So, my thoughts on Gary Payton is that I think that in today's basketball, he's sort of unsung, right? He's not one of the guys people talk about a lot. Most people talk about when it comes to great point guards, even though he is a top 10 all-time point guard. All right. Kind of high on that list, actually. I think he's like, to me, top 6, 7 at the least. Um, but when people think about the great point guards, I think they think about Magic Johnson, Oscar Robertson. If you consider Jerry West a point guard, you consider Jerry West, uh, you know, Isaiah Thomas, uh, you know, John Stockton. I think maybe some people might even think of Jason Kidd, Bob Cousy, maybe even Steve Nash comes to mind. But I think with some people, Gary Payton, you have to think about it. And then you'll say, oh yeah, Gary Payton. And the reason why I think that is because what's emphasized today. And what's emphasized is offense, 3-point shooting. Um, and when it comes to passing, uh, point guard position now, of course, getting assists and triple doubles. So of course, and winning championships. So of course, when it comes to triple doubles, you'll think of Magic, Oscar, Russell Westbrook later on. Even though I don't think he's in that top 10 discussion to me right now. Uh, Maybe at the bottom, but anyway, yeah, you think of Magic, Oscar, Russell, of course, Westbrook. You think of Jason Kidd. When you think of great shooting point guards, guys that could hit the shot, even if they weren't per se great scorers, you think of Steve Nash, you think of course, John Stockton, right? All right, when you think of uh, great passing or great passers, of course you think of Magic, you think of Robertson, you think of Cousy, you think of Nash, you think of Kidd. Winning championships, you think of Magic, you think of Zeke. But Peyton doesn't jump out of your mind because he's synonymous with defense, which isn't emphasized as much. And although Gary Payton did win a championship, he wasn't able to win one in his best years. All right, he won one toward the end of his career. Um, and of course, famously and infamously, he failed to win a title along with Karl Malone when everybody expected him to win one in 2004 when they joined the Lakers. The Lakers were supposed to have been a super team, but although they made it to the finals, they lost to the upstart and in their own respective right, the unsung Detroit Pistons from that year. But Gary Payton, all right, Gary Payton hailed from Oakland. Another great point guard that came from Oakland, of course, was Jason Kidd. And Jason Kidd considers Gary Payton to be a mentor of his. Gary Payton went to Oregon State University, and he was drafted second overall. Doesn't that sound a little familiar? Point guard drafted second overall in the 1990 NBA draft. Um, Interesting story about Gary Payton is there were two pretty embarrassing trash talking stories I remember reading about him. One was during a preseason game from his rookie year. So this is before he played the official NBA game. And he was talking trash. They were playing the Chicago Bulls. And Gary Payton was talking trash to B.J. Armstrong and then toward Michael Jordan, who was sitting on the bench at the time. So the first game of the season, well, not the first game of the season, but the first game that they play against each other, I think it might have been in Chicago. I'm not certain. But Jordan went out and shut down Gary Payton. Payton only had 2 points, had 4 turnovers. And Jordan went out and scored 33 points, 33 easy points on Gary Payton, who was noted for his defensive prowess. And he told Gary Payton something to the effect of, that shit you was talking in the preseason, this is the real shit right here. Welcome to the NBA, little fella. Something like that. And there was another incident that happened. I think this might have been when they were in Seattle that same year. And they were supposedly in a nightclub. They interacted with each other, I guess, in a popular nightclub in the area. And Jordan ran into Gary Payton, and Gary Payton was bragging about the type of cars that he was driving. Basically he was bragging about the fact that he had just purchased a Ferrari Testarossa, right? Very popular car back in that time. And Jordan listened to him talk. And then Jordan told him, shit, I get my cars for free. And then walked off and shit. So, and then I think in that game, Jordan dropped like 46 on Gary Payton. So, Gary Payton had a decent, solid year, but he wasn't living up to the expectations that you would expect from a second overall pick, And doesn't that sound familiar? Gary Payton struggled the first 2 years of his career on the offensive side of the ball. Now, defensively, he was very good. Not quite the glove yet, but he was very good. But it was on offensive side that he really wasn't living up to his expectations. But it was his third year in the NBA, the 92-93 season, that Gary Payton started becoming Gary Payton. All right? And I think it was during the 93 playoffs that was Gary Payton's coming out party. I can't remember the fucking team they played against. I think it was the Phoenix Suns. I know ultimately they lost to the Phoenix Suns in the Western Conference Finals, but it was during the 93 playoffs that Gary Payton really came into his own. And the 1994 season was the first year that Gary Payton was an all-star. Gary Payton became a prodigious scorer as a point guard. When you consider the eras, they got to consider something. Now, if you go and Google basketball reference and say, but he only averaged 19, 18, 20, 22, 22, there ain't a lot of points. But you got to consider the era that he played in, all right? You got to consider the era that Gary Payton played in. That was an era where teams and franchises still believed that you should go through your big man more. Some of the top scorers in the NBA at that time, a lot of them were still post players, like your Shaqs, your Elijah Wans, your David Robinsons, your Charles Barkleys, your Karl Malones. Later on, even some lower tier guys like Alonzo Mourning, all right, Derek Coleman before he got fat and shit. Derek Coleman, even before he got hurt, Danny Manning with the Clippers had some good seasons, dropping 19, 20 points a game. So point guards really didn't get the green light to score like that in that era. So for Gary Payton to be dropping 19, 20 points per game in that era is very impressive. Gary Payton was also never a great shooter. He, I would say when it comes to shooting, outside shooting, he was a little bit better than Russell Westbrook because he was 32% for his career, I think, like that. But he was never like a knockdown three-point shooter like a Mark Price or a Nash, or certainly not like a Steph Curry. But he could hit him. He could knock him down if he was open. But what I remember about Gary Payton was he actually, even though he was 6'4", 180, 190 pounds. He was strong. He was strong and he was quick. And that made him because of his strength and his quickness, that made him a very effective post player. When he had the matchup problems or the matchup situations in his favor. One thing I remember too about the Sonics teams from the 90s is they gave the Houston Rockets problems. I think the big reason why they gave them problems to me is two reasons. After they traded Otis Thorpe, even when they had Otis Thorpe, Shawn Kemp was a mismatch at the 4. And also, Gary Payton and Nate McMillan, who's forgotten, another great defensive guard, they gave the Houston Rockets problems in that backcourt. The Houston Rockets backcourt they had some good shooters back there. Vernon Maxwell, who was a very good defensive player in his own right. Kenny Smith, a great shooter. Sam Cassell was young at the time. But they were not big. Kenny Smith and Sam Cassell were like 6'3". Vernon Maxwell 6'1" or something like that. They gave them problems, man. But the thing about the 93-94 season, the Sonics won 63 games that year, which was at the time a franchise record. And they were expected to be contenders to go to the NBA Finals. But they were upset that year in the first round by the Denver Nuggets. But what I remember about Gary Payton from the mid-90s all the way to about the mid-2000s, or about 2003, 2004 at least, Gary Payton was tough, tenacious, shit talker, and the top defensive guard in the league in that time period. All right. And there was a lot of really good defensive guards at that time in the NBA. Notably Michael Jordan himself, but Gary Payton was the top. He's the only point guard in NBA history to win Defensive Player of the Year. John Stockton has said that the only point guards to ever give him trouble in his career, and John Stockton played 19 years, the only point guards to give him trouble are Magic Johnson and Gary Payton. During that 96 season when Gary Payton won Defensive Player of the Year, the Seattle Supersonics won a franchise record 64 games and made it all the way to the NBA Finals. The Bulls had won 72 games that year, and for the most part during the playoffs, they had a pretty easy run of it. The only game that they had lost prior to the finals was an overtime loss to the Knicks. And it looked like going into that series was going to be easy. Well into that series, Jordan was averaging over 30 points per game the first 3 games of that series, and the Bulls had a 3-0 lead. But George Karl switched Gary Payton on Michael Jordan, and that changed the trajectory of the series. For the next 2 games, the Sonics ran the Bulls out of the building, and Jordan struggled to score versus Gary Payton's defense. And game 6 of that series, the Bulls were able to win and close out the series in 6. But Jordan struggled again. He only shot 5 of 19 from the floor. And for the series, Michael Jordan had his worst overall numbers in the NBA Finals in his career. He only averaged 27.3 points on like 41% shooting from the floor. And even though Jordan would not fully say that Gary Payton shut him down, that did stick in Jordan's craw for a while. And Jordan, in the next matchup that they had against the Sonics, which was February the think it was February the 2nd, 1997, right? I'll never forget it came on NBC. They call it the George Call game, too, because George Call insinuated Jordan wasn't driving to the basket anymore because he was afraid to get injured. Jordan scored like 45 points against Gary Payton and the Sonics. And if the Sonics hadn't made a concerted effort to get the ball out of his hands the last 5 minutes of that game, the way Jordan was cooking, I think he would have scored easily 55 to 60 points that game. He was cooking. I think he was 19 or 28 from the floor, and it was mostly jump shots, including a half-court three-pointer at the buzzer at halftime. No, a half-court buzzer. Was it halftime or at the end of the first quarter? I can't remember. But anyway, going back to Gary Payton, him and Sean Kemp, who never fulfilled his potential as a player, but him and Sean Kemp formed an impressive tandem. And they were one of the top teams in the NBA in the mid-1990s. But of course, ultimately, Sean Kemp left pretty much due to a contract dispute. He was traded to the Cleveland Cavaliers, and that team fully became Gary Payton's team for the rest of the 1990s into the early 2000s. And while, they never quite were on that same level, like a 55-60 win team, Gary Payton kept that team formidable for a while, just through his sheer brilliant, excellent play. He was one of the top point guards in the NBA during that entire span. I'm thinking through my head. I'm trying to think right now. I'm trying to think before I say this, but after Anthony Payton Hardaway had his injuries and he fell off, Jason Kidd was Jason Kidd, all right? But whenever they went up against each other in their primes, Gary Payton genuinely won that matchup between the two. So I'm thinking before I say this, Steve Nash wasn't Steve Nash. Tim Hardaway was falling off. Yeah, I would say from 1998 until 2003, I would say that Gary Payton was the best point guard in the NBA. I'm thinking hard, but I think he was the best point guard in the NBA. And another thing about Gary Payton was his longevity. He played 17 years in the NBA at a time when there weren't a lot of point guards playing that long. All right, but he played 17 years in the NBA. And during the 2002-2003 season, I believe it was, I think this is when he was traded to the Milwaukee Bucks. George Karl had went from being the coach of the Sonics to the Bucks at that time. And George Karl just had it in his head that he had to change the dynamics of that team. He had to, because George Karl was about defense. That wasn't the identity of that Bucks team. So he traded away Ray Allen for Gary Payton. And as many Bucks fans have said, there was no way in hell that Gary Payton was going to stay with the Bucks. And ultimately, he left. He went to play with the Boston Celtics for 1 year, I believe. But then, but by this time, Gary Payton was chasing a championship. That's when he went to the Lakers. By the time he went to the Lakers, during the 2003-2004 season, Gary Payton was no longer Gary Payton. He was no longer Gary Payton. And while they did eventually go to the finals, they lost in that series to the Los Angeles Lakers. After that period of time, Gary Payton totally fell off as a player. Okay, he totally fell off as a basketball player and was a shell of himself. But he was finally able. He was finally able, as the Miami Heat, to win a championship in 2006. in that series. They came back against the Dallas Mavericks, and Gary Payton played one more year in the NBA before he retired in 2007. But Gary Payton's accolades are more than deserving of a player in the NBA Hall of Fame. Like I said, he won the championship in 2006 with the Miami Heat. He was a 9-time NBA All-Star, twice on the All-NBA first team, 5 times on the All-NBA second team, and twice on the All-NBA third team. Like I said before, he won the Defensive Player of the Year award in 1995-96, leading the NBA in steals with 2.9 per game. And he's the only point guard to win Defensive Player of the Year. 9 times he was on the NBA All-Defensive First Team. And that's a record that he shares with Michael Jordan, Kobe Bryant, and I believe Kevin Garnett. He led the NBA steals, like I said, 95-96. Twice he won Olympic gold. First time in 1996 in Atlanta, and in 2000 in Sydney. And for his career, he averaged 16.3 points, 6.7 assists, and 1.8 steals. But during his 10-year prime from 1993 to about 2003, Gary Payton averaged better than 20 points per game, well over 4 rebounds per game, close to 8 assists per game, and over 2 steals per game. All right, so Gary Payton is one of the best players in his position in NBA history. He's arguably the best two-way point guard ever. When you think about the fact that he's the best defensive point guard of all time, and you think about the fact that he could score. Let me look at something right quick on Basketball Reference. Gary Payton made the All-Star team for 9 consecutive years. Would have been 10 straight years, but there was no All-Star game in 99. But he would have been an All-Star in 99. But this is what I want to look at. Gary Payton averaged from 1993-94 to 2002-2003. He averaged 16.5 points, then 20.6, 19.3, 21.8, 19.2, 21.7, 24.2, 23.2, 22.1, 20.4, and then 20.4. All right, so during that 10-year span, he averaged 20 points per game 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 times. This was in an era, like I said before, where point guards generally did not score at that level. You know, they just weren't scorers at that level. Just going through some numbers right quick. Trying to just emphasize how the eras were different at that particular time. Like now you have a league that's littered with point guards that are the NBA leaders in scoring, or amongst the leaders in scoring. All right. The 1999-2000 season, Shaquille O'Neal led the NBA in scoring 29.7 points per game. Allen Iverson, who was a point guard but moved over to the shooting guard position, was second at 28.4. Grant Hill, small forward, 25.8. Vince Carter, shooting guard, 25.7. Karl Malone, power forward, 25.5. Chris Webber, a power forward, 24.5. Gary Payton, the point guard, 24.2. I'm just gonna name the positions. Jerry Stackhouse, shooting guard. Tim Duncan, power forward. Kevin Garnett, power forward. Michael Finley, shooting guard. Kobe Bryant, shooting guard. Now Stephon Marbury was a point guard. All right, he averaged 22.2. Ray Allen, shooting guard. Alonzo Mourning, power forward / center. Uh, Glenn Robinson, well, that year he was a center. Glenn Robinson, small forward. Antoine Walker, power forward. Abdul Rahim, power forward. Elton Brand, power forward. Eddie Jones, shooting guard. I'm going to go further with this to emphasize the point I'm trying to make. Allen Houston, shooting guard. Paul Pierce, small forward. Keith Van Horn, small forward / power forward. And Tony McDyess, power forward. Next point guard on this list is Sam Cassell. All right? He's 25th in scoring. The next point guard that you see after him is Stevie Franchise. Now, you notice I named all those guys, right? Steve Francis averaged 18 points a game. Now, after Steve Francis, the next point guard on the list is Terrell Brandon at 39th in scoring, 16.7. So basically the point I'm making is that was not an era where point guards got the green light to shoot as much. And Gary Payton was the top scorer of those point guards. So that's why I think Gary Payton, to me, especially when we consider the championship that he won, he should be a lot higher in people's minds when it comes to point guards. Because he was, like I said, for a stretch, the best offensive point guard in the NBA, as well as the best defensive point guard in the NBA, which is rare. You know what I'm saying? That's one of the reasons why people have Michael Jordan as the GOAT, or at least up there in the conversation, is because for a long stretch of his career, Michael Jordan was the best defensive and offensive player in the NBA. Gary Payton, for a long stretch of his career, was the best offensive and defensive point guard in the NBA, and one of the best offensive point guards and defensive point guards when you combine, both sides of the court, two-way, excuse me. When you combine the two-way aspect of it, Gary Payton belongs in the conversation. I want to look at something else, too, about the matchup between him and Jason Kidd, because whenever they used to go at each other, I noticed that Gary Payton used to win that matchup a lot. So I'm just going to look to see if the facts back that up. Maybe it doesn't, but I just want to see something right quick. All right. Well, actually, interesting enough, Jason Kidd is 22-19 against Gary Payton. So he actually won the career matchup. But Gary Payton outscored him, shot better. I don't know. I got to look at some of this stuff too, because it could be taking Gary Payton's poor years into perspective too. Because I know when they went against each other in their best, Jason Kidd used to lose those matchups a lot. And yeah, he did. Because I'm looking at the first couple of years with Jason Kidd, I see L, 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 W, L, W, W, L, L, L. Yeah, so it's more like toward the end. It's more like toward the end where Gary Payton aged and Jason Kidd was still in his best years, where he caught up and probably overtook him in wins. But yeah, I'm looking at this shit. Gary Payton outscored him 28-10, 22-3, 21-9, 24-13, 13-7, 29-22. That game, Jason Kidd outscored Gary Payton 36-20, but then Gary Payton outscored him 19-12, 23-19, 24-11, 22-5, 30-6, 22-12, 31-30. Yeah, so it's like, you know what I'm saying? Like, you just watch basketball for a while, you kind of like notice certain shit. So yeah, to close this video up, Gary Payton is one of the top point guards of all time. I think you can make a case he's top 5. He's the greatest defensive point guard of all time. On the grandest stage in basketball, he gave Michael Jordan the greatest test of his career. Okay. And in an era which wasn't, suited for point guards to score big, he was the era's top scoring point guard. From the late 1990s through the early 2000s, he was the top scoring point guard in the NBA, and his best defensive player at that position. So Gary Payton is more than, he's more than deserving of being in that conversation amongst the great point guards of all time. Another thing, too, now I'm saying this will spark my anger a couple of weeks ago, is when Kendrick Perkins made that list of the greatest Thunder. Now, I understand what he was saying. He was talking about since they became the Thunder. But you got to also remember that until the NBA creates a Sonics franchise, the Sonics history gets brought under the umbrella of the Thunder. So when you talk about the greatest Thunder, you're also including the Sonics. There's no way in hell. Now, don't get me wrong. Even if you include the Sonics history, Kevin Durant is the greatest Thunder / Sonics. He even played with the Sonics before they switched over, right? Kevin Durant's the greatest Thunder / Sonic. But I would not rank Russell Westbrook ahead of Gary Payton. I just wouldn't do it. I'm sorry. I wouldn't do it. No. If you put Gary Payton in today's NBA, all right, and you give him the green light to shoot like all these other point guards, I think his shooting percentages will be lower. I think it'd be more like 44%, all right? But I think defensively, all right, he still, even though you can't put your hands on guys, he still had the quickness, right? He still had the quickness with his feet. He still had the quickness to be an effective defensive player. They didn't call him the glove for nothing. Number one, he was a great help defender. He was a great individual defender, and he had quick hands. I see him getting a lot of fucking steals still. I still see him being able to, be effective defensively against guys in the league. And the biggest weapon he would have is the psychological warfare that he would assault on guys. Now, if he was able to get in the heads of guys like Michael Jordan and Reggie Miller, and if he was able to get in the heads of guys like that, Isaiah Thomas to an extent, if he was able to get into their heads for a while, what the fuck you think he gonna do to Lonzo Ball and all these soft dudes in the NBA? Man, Gary Payton would have these motherfuckers crying, ready to quit basketball. If Patrick Beverly look, man, if Patrick Beverly was able to punch the ball out of fucking LeBron's hands, what do you think prime Gary Payton would do if he was with the Clippers? Put prime Gary Payton on the Clippers? They winning the championship. Ain't no doubt in my mind. If you give Gary Payton that much fucking help, man, ain't no way in the fucking hell the Clippers would lose to any team in a series. But that's all I got to say, man. Gary Payton deserves that respect more than he's getting.